Now, my sincere pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Cage Leitner. Cage has been speaking about and educating others about inclusion of all gender identities for over a decade. Through the telling of his own personal lived experiences as a member of the LGBTQ community, mixed with relevant, tangible information, Cage creates an environment of expansive growth mindset to learn about a complex and often challenging subject. As the founder of Quantum Gender and the nonprofit soccer club Portland Community Football Club, Cage is well-versed in the challenges that entrepreneurs face, especially when it comes to creating a foundation of inclusion within a new business. Cage graduated from Portland State University in 2012 with a master's in social work and now currently teaches as an adjunct professor in the department. When Cage isn't running two businesses and teaching, you can find him on the soccer field coaching or playing, and also spending time with his partner and their pit bull, Charlie. Good morning, Cage.
Good morning. Thanks, everyone. It's so nice to have you all here. And it's good to just take a deep breath these days. I've been doing a lot of that. And I just encourage us to all just settle in this morning and allow the information to flow over you. It's a lot of information that I'm going to dig into today. Deconstructing privilege is an ever lengthening and long journey, and we're going to just scratch the surface. So let's get to it. I've got some more information I want to tell you about myself before I get into the content today that I think is really important. As Lori mentioned, I am a member of the LGBTQ+ community, and specifically my identity is one of being a queer trans person. So that means that I was assigned the sex of female at birth. And that's the correct language to use, is the language of assigned sex, as opposed to I was born a boy or I was born a girl. Those words are attached to gender. Boy and girl are attached to gender. The words female and male are attached to sex. And so that's an important thing to know. I know some people are still learning a lot of things around inclusivity of trans folks. And so that's just a quick little tip on how to talk about it. And I really explicitly come out to you right off the bat today, because if I didn't, you probably would have no idea that I am a trans person. Maybe you'd get a clue that maybe I'm gay or I'm queer because I was introduced as being part of that community. But because of my gender presentation, what I'm wearing, the length of my hair, what I look like out into the world, I fit these norms of looking cisgender and often being assumed to be straight. But my lived experience as a queer trans person, it is the lens through which I understand the world around me. And it's how I understand privilege. It's how I understand a lot of the concepts we're going to talk today about. And I'm going to share a whole lot more about myself later on, but I just want to start with that so that you all know where I'm coming from and that I get to share my authentic self with you right from the beginning. So let's dive in here to this journey that we're going to go on today. And that's what I want it to feel like. I want it to feel like we're going on a journey together where we're going to dive into each of these bubbles you see here in front of you on the screen. And we're going to really dive into what are these words, what are these ideas and concepts behind these words, because that's really how we're going to get to this ultimate goal of trying to understand what psychological safety is. So let's first get into deconstructing. What does this word mean? How can you deconstruct something when you don't know what's been constructed? You have to think about and understand what's been constructed, what's been built, and why. And so we're going to do a little bit of history on this section here. So there's three primary social structures that have determined the course of history in the US. Those three structures you see there: masculinity, white superiority, and heterosexual norms. When Englanders first came to the Atlantic coast, it was white, cisgender, heterosexual man who were seen as the standard of identity that holds power and make decisions for the creation of that society that was beginning to be created. I think most of us probably at this point agree that understanding history is so critical to deconstructing privilege. But I want us to dive in deeper into these structures from the human side, from thinking about us as a collective human, and to put ourselves in the time period of this moment, to contemplate what these norms were and why these norms that we now can see as damaging, why were they seen as legitimate back then? And this is not intended in any way to be a full history or to really get into the very lengthy and very difficult and complex history of this country. Instead, it's meant to be a framework that highlights how ideas and concepts travel through space and time. So that's the framework we're going to start with today. So let's dive into masculinity first. There's two different aspects that I want to talk about in masculinity, and we're going to look at social order first. So if we go in this human aspect idea, think about yourself as being a colonizer in this time period when they're attempting to start a new life in a new country. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about folks back in this time, particularly white, straight, heterosexual men, I think about all the horrific things that were done to indigenous people, to tribes, to enslaved Africans during this time. And I sort of just demonize those folks right off the bat. That's where my mind goes to immediately. But if we can just put that aside for just a minute, we're going to get into it more, but just put it aside for a minute. Think about that time period of the 1600s, leaving England, coming to a new place. There's no governance. There's very little social order. There's high disease and death. It's common as a livelihood and a lively experience. And so in those conditions, humans fall back on what they know for self-preservation. We know that of humans. And so these humans at this time, they knew of this social order that you see on the screen in front of you. They knew of these things that were coming from their experiences from England. They saw them as legitimate there. They saw them as working there. Why would they question it? They weren't questioned in England. And if they need to create a new social environment and get economic viability and all these things that they need, these things seem perfectly reasonable to uphold. And so these concepts and ideas, their ideas, big, bold word ideas of male dominance and gender norms literally traveled across space and time. It came from another place with them, and these ideas continued on. They created a reality for themselves in this new place. Now, we have been in the very strange circumstances of seeing real time, large groups of people creating their own realities currently. We have watched sections of our society create their own reality. And so we know that's possible. So their reality was that this was what masculinity looked like. They held on to these ideas, even when they were shown that there was another way of doing it. Let me give you an example. When these folks came over to the Atlantic coast, they interacted, of course, with indigenous tribes. We know that. We know the horrific history of that. But they also observed indigenous tribes, and they were watching what was going on in these other social structures. Even when they saw some of the tribes on the Atlantic coast that were a matriarchal society, meaning the women owned and built the houses, they ran and propagated the crops, they had authority in their tribes because of that. That was a very different structure than what these men were seeing. And when they saw the indigenous men fishing, because that's what the indigenous men did to supplement the diet, the English men read that as lazy, because in England, fishing is a recreation, not something to do for sustenance necessarily. So what that did was that immediately said to those English men, those English white men, these Native American men are lazy, they're shiftless, they're shirking their responsibilities as a man, and they saw the indigenous men as less than them. And it further cemented in their mind, their righteousness of their masculinity, their kind of masculinity, and then of course their white superiority. So I use that as an example of, we have to think about the way that ideas were being propagated and upheld at this certain time to really understand what was being constructed. And so the other aspect of this is the dominant culture that was created out of that was created out of all those ideas and concepts. this is nothing new. We know this. We know the economic participation, political, and the property ownership of white cis straight men was happening at that time. But think about what those things afforded to those men. It afforded them the ability to construct what society looks like. And that ability to construct was coming from their place of power, their place of being listened to, and the assumption that they knew best, that they were the ones that could be looked to construct this society. And that's all just around masculinity, right? That's all just around one aspect of these structures. And so then if we look at white superiority, and we get into the social order of white superiority, this is again as a reinforced norm derived from creating social order. They're trying to figure out how their society is going to function at this time. So white superiority, right off the bat, I'm going to talk about it for about 3 minutes. It deserves obviously 1,000% time more than that. But what I want to do in this section is I want to highlight a specific person who was so influential to the propagation of the ideas of white superiority. This person is Cotton Mather, and I've just recently learned about him, so that I'm new to this history as well. I first learned about Cotton Mather by reading Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. Absolutely critical must read for everybody, but especially white folks. You'll get that in the list of resources at the end. And I'm just curious from the audience here, if you have not heard of Cotton Mather, just put a little 1 in your chat box. I just want to, I'm curious how many folks have not heard of him. I have to open up my chat box to see that. Yeah, lots of 1s. Absolutely. This is, that's what I expected, because to tell you the truth, when I read about him, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, when I read about him in Stamped from the Beginning, my mouth fell to the floor. And now, since I know about him, I'm finding him referenced in all sorts of other historical times, also around gender, also around women, the ideas of how women should behave. So let me tell you a little bit about him. So he believed that if white Christians were to convert enslaved African people, they would learn the values of white society, and their souls would become white, and they would become white. They would be saved. It was sort of this like kind of outlandish idea to us. But that racist thought, which is clearly a racist thought, it wasn't coming from hate. It wasn't coming from a place of, I hate these people, they don't deserve anything. It was coming from a place of, I have all this superiority, and clearly white is the way to go. So let's bring them along. Let's change them. Let's convert them and bring them along into our culture to a certain level, right? There was still not really wanting to bring them all the way up. But that was coming from a place of white superiority and also white savior, right? It's a classic example of a white savior mentality of these people are less than, they need help. We are the ones to help. This also preserved the social hierarchy, which he believed, Cotton Mather, he believed it was ordained by God, it was God's rules, and that anyone defied this hierarchy was akin to Satan. These ideas to us most likely seem just terrible, completely narrow viewed. Just how could anyone be thinking these things? And let alone how could anybody else think that this was okay? Well, it was quite the opposite in that time. As you can see, he was the most published American writer in the 18th century. His ideas were going everywhere. Everyone was reading what he had to say. He was publishing paper and pamphlet and book after book after book. And people were listening to him because he was at the top. He was right here at this top part of this pyramid. And all these other groups of people underneath, they either listened to him and believed him, or just had to listen to him and try to ignore him. But lots and lots and lots of people, thousands of people across this country, listened to him. And then those ideas traveled through space and time. Those ideas influenced who we are as a country today, believe it or not, somebody who was writing things in the 18th century. And so the reason why I highlight him, and the reason why it struck me so grandly when I read about him, was because of how his ideas have influenced other ideas. And the only reason his ideas were influencing others is because of his white skin and because of his white superiority. That was who was listened to at the time. And so to kind of wrap up this one little part here, this quote from Ibram Kendi's book, I think really summarizes what Cotton Mather was telling white people and Black people about the choices that Black people had at that time. And the choice was either righteous assimilation to whiteness and slavery to God and God's minions, or segregated criminal Blackness and slavery to the devil and the devil's minions. You're either saved or you're a slave. You're either a slave to God or you're a slave to white people. That is what he believed. That is what he told people. And that is what other people believed. So that's the social order that was experienced, that was going on around white superiority. And this final one of heterosexual norms is going to be really quick because it ties into everything else I just talked about. Basically the same idea that there's these God's laws, that sex outside of marriage is a sin, and sex is only intended for procreation. Gender, the gender norms are impacting the sexuality of women because men are told that they are there to control women's desire and sexual behavior, because women are seen as irrational. They're a spawn of Eve who could not control herself, and so women are not able to make their own decisions. That is how heterosexual norms were seen in that time, and they, again, traveled through space and time to where we are now. So these ideas, this is the construct. I just did a lightning speed round of the construct of 3 of the largest societal manufactured ideas that we have in our society and in our country, because that is what has impacted where we're headed, right? Where we are now and where we're headed, and it's been impacting our history. And obviously, so many things have changed since the 1600s, but the root of these 3 concepts is still absolutely impacting us today, and is ultimately impacts how we do or do not have privilege, and how we understand and don't understand privilege. So I want to pause there for a minute because I gave you a whole lot of information. I need to take a little drink of water. And I want to just open up the chat box to thoughts, questions, pushbacks, anything that you have kind of resonated with you during this moment.
And if people would like to use the raise hand feature, we can unmute you and you can speak freely as well, if that's a little bit easier than typing out your thoughts.
Absolutely.
Susan says that in New England, we know this guy. His African slang is famous for bringing smallpox. Ooh, and then it went away because I can't keep up with it. I'm reading some of these aloud so that those that are watching this recorded can know what we're viewing here in our chat box. Jacqueline adds, it doesn't seem like anything is changing. Norman enters, reflection of the Bible view of roles of man and woman. And another call out for stamped from the beginning.
Great. Excellent. Yeah, and this is a lot of information to kind of absorb in this quick amount of time, but it sets up the framework for where we're headed. So let's jump into the next bubble here of talking about privilege. It's just the next step on this journey that we're really all going on. So here we are with kind of the basic ideas that we have around privilege, that all of these intersect and overlap with each other. I think it's important for you to know how I think of privilege, what it means from my perspective, because it's important for you to get your own definition. It really unpacks it for yourself. And I understand privilege as experiencing access to the benefits, all the benefits of our society, because I appear, very important, to fit into the social norms that have been constructed. Clearly I'm white. That's no question, but I appear to be cisgender and I appear to be straight. So therefore I'm at the top of that pyramid, assumingly, at the top of that pyramid for privilege. And I experience a lot of those privileges, and I'm gonna really dive into that later. So I'm gonna get nitty gritty on that. But what I also wanna bring up is that psychological safety, I believe, is one of the highest levels of privilege that one can have and that I now experience. And it's the result of me moving up into that higher levels of hierarchy. And as I've moved up into those higher levels of privilege with psychological safety and everything that I experience, I see that I have a responsibility of a burden to hold around privilege. And that's the other part of my definition of privilege, is that there's a burden to hold. And what I mean by that is that for me, the way I feel that is I'm constantly questioning what I'm saying, who I'm saying it to, who's in the room, who's not in the room, why are they not in the room? Did I just say something that maybe if somebody doesn't know I'm queer and trans and they think I'm just another white dude, I just stepped all over them? Did I usurp their conversation? I mean, it's kind of a constant dialogue going on in my head, and that's part of privilege. That's what should be happening. If you have privilege at higher and higher levels, you have to be thinking about it. It's just a requirement of having privilege, but that's not what privilege is being taught, right? That's not how we think about privilege. We think about privilege as just like, yeah, you got the whole world at your fingertips. But that mental weight and sometimes that emotional weight that I carry with my privilege is a fraction, an absolute minuscule fraction of what Black women experience every day in our society, what Black trans women experience even to a greater degree every day in our society, and so on and so on. So I'll take that burden. I'll have it, because I will pick up that extra weight of that privilege. And that is what I encourage, especially white, cis, heterosexual men. Pick up that burden. You can carry it. It's not as heavy as it is for everybody else. So let's dive into this word psychological as we kind of go along the journey here of diving into these words and what they mean. Psychological is part of our in understanding of ourselves. This quote here is the knowledge of the soul. And I think that just summarizes so beautifully what it means to think about the psychology of ourselves. And we know that there's mental health that's a part of psychology. We know emotional intelligence and behavior, but I want to get into this mental health part. And this is where I'm going to start telling you some stories about myself. The rest of this presentation is actually going to be a lot of stories about me. And I'm very comfortable and very open about stories about myself and my history, because that's how I use my privilege. That's where I see it's best served. So here I am at age 9, and I'm going to talk about some trauma that I experienced at this time. But before I tell you this story, it's really, really important that I highlight that I am an incredibly fortunate and privileged person amongst my trans family and community, that I have experienced less trauma than a lot of them. And I've had the ability to heal from the trauma that I've experienced. Large in part due to the family that I have. I have an incredibly supportive family that helped me heal from that. And it's allowed me, honestly, to be here with you today, to tell you these stories, to be able to talk about these things and to share my experiences with you. So that's an important thing to know about me. So this story is about this time in my life when I'm at this age of age 9, and I had a pretty traumatic event that still impacts me somewhat today. At this time in my life, these thought bubbles that you see up on the screen, that's what I thought of myself. I had a lot of shame around myself. I really felt like I didn't belong anywhere. I always felt like there was something wrong with me. And one day I was with my mom in our, we went to our local gym to go work out one day as a family, and we were in the locker room together, my mom and I, and she's finishing up doing whatever she needs to do. And I'm standing there all fully dressed and ready to go, feeling pretty anxious because I've got my baseball cap on and my t-shirt and my cargo pants. Before cargo pants were cool, they're not cool anymore. And standing around, looking around, seeing people noticing me, staring at me, which was common. I was used to people staring at me. And I knew what they were thinking. They were thinking I didn't belong. I looked weird. I looked like a boy. And sure enough, somebody came walking up to my mom and said, we think that your son is too old to be in this locker room. Now, my mom, who may very well be on the call today, actually, or my dad, my mom is a mama bear. She just stood right up and said, this is my daughter, Kate, and she belongs here. Now, thank goodness for my mom. She's an incredible woman, but what was happening for me at that time was utter trauma and embarrassment and ashamed feelings for, I've been called out once again as being a total freak. I wanted to just bury myself in the ground and get out of there as quickly as possible. And so what was happening for me in that moment was trauma. It was physical trauma that I was experiencing inside my body in the form of anxiety and stress and all the things we know about trauma. It was creating a traumatic pathway in my brain around locker rooms, which I still have some of that. And so that was building that experience of trauma around my identity, around who I am in this world. And that's just one story that just highlights some of the trauma that I've experienced. So then if we move into this other aspect of mental health is anxiety. I don't think there's a person in this society who doesn't experience anxiety at this point. We just experience them in different ways and different levels. It took me well into my 20s and quite a few years of therapy to even recognize that what I was feeling as a young kid, as a young adult, was anxiety. I didn't even know what it was. And it came from these thoughts you see I've got up on the screen in front of you. Who's watching me? Who's going to publicly shame me? I was always on edge. I was always ready to be called out, to be asked, am I a boy or a girl? To be called an it. It was just always on the back of my mind. And the other part of my anxiety was I always felt I had to perform perfectly, especially in sports. Not because of pressure from my parents or things like that, but because I already recognized that I didn't fit, that people were seeing me for something that was weird. So if I could perform perfectly, if I could be one of those perfect athletes, then maybe they would see me just for that and they wouldn't see me as a freak of nature. So that anxiety around performing perfectly, I have a feeling there's some people on the call today that probably know what that feels like, because if you're not part of the dominant culture, most often you feel like you have to perform perfectly or better than a lot of people that you work with who are in the dominant culture. That's a pretty common feeling. So I felt that too as a trans person. So I'm going to share a really quick story with you about me at this age that kind of really highlights this feeling of anxiety and these thoughts that I had. This is me at the age of 17. I'm walking out to my high school varsity soccer game. And at one of the games, could have even been this game where this picture was taken, I was warming up on the track in front of a huge student body. I went to a really big high school. There's about 300 people there watching the varsity soccer game. I'm warming up, and it's what you need to know about me as an athlete is I was focused. It was my job to go out there and perform perfectly and be competitive. And so I was just laser focused, doing my thing. I finally get ready to go into the game. I'm standing on the sidelines. And as I'm running into the field, I hear, as if every other sound in the stadium has ceased to exist, I hear somebody say, "They're putting the boy in front of everybody." I'm running onto the field. I'm clearly the only person that they're talking about. And so at that moment in my life, that was the worst public shaming I'd ever received about who I am. And so I go on and I'm supposed to play a soccer game now. I'm supposed to focus on what I'm doing. I can't focus. I'm jittery. Everything in my body just went completely numb. My brain went numb. And I couldn't play, right? Everything just fell apart. And the level of anxiety that I felt in that moment stuck with me. That is one of the strongest memories I have of that age and being publicly shamed and being reinforced that I am just no good, that I just don't belong anywhere. So I tell you these two stories because it's the expression of what I know of trauma and anxiety in my life that has impacted a lot around who I am. And these two other bubbles of emotional intelligence and behavior, we know those are important. I'm going to skip those for today just for the sake of time because I've got some more content around safety that I really want to get to. But it's important to hold on to those stories around that mental health of anxiety and trauma, because it really impacts what I now know about safety, what I now understand about safety. And let me be a little bit more specific about that. So when we talk about safety,
Hey, Cage.
Yeah.
I'd just like to interrupt you for just a moment to
Sure.
thank you for sharing your story. And again, even though this is a remote call and we're not sharing a room with you, that to hear you share an old story and to imagine what that was like for you. I feel that in my nervous system, right? I feel that anxiety in my chest. I feel tears welling up because I know you and I love you. And even if I didn't, that kind of public shaming or humility is not okay for anyone. So thank you for sharing that. And I don't want us to just carry on with the video as if you didn't expose vulnerability and give us an opportunity to witness that and acknowledge that and let you know that we're feeling that with you.
You're going to make me cry, which is hard for me to do after starting testosterone. That's all. I could do a whole presentation on that. Thank you, Lori. That is incredibly kind as my friend and my colleague, and also a really great modeling of what to do when folks come out, when it's safe and when you have the right space. No matter what the coming out is, it doesn't have to be around sexuality or gender. It can be around a lot of different things. And I appreciate that. And you know, I do feel like I'm rushing a little bit through this because I want to get to everything, but I do appreciate that a lot. And I'm gonna dive into the rest of this, and I'm gonna share even some more things with all of you that may give you some feelings. So happy to hear more about those feelings as we go through. So
thank you, back to regular programming. I just want to like acknowledge your humanity here for a moment.
Thank you, Lori. I am a human. It's true. So the pictures you see in front of you are clearly me. And what I want to highlight in this to talk about the feeling of having psychological safety with lower anxiety, right? This achievement of like, whoo, I have lower anxiety, so I feel a bit more psychologically safe. I've experienced that through my transition. So when I was, you know, in my 20s, I was going by Kate. I was using she, her, and hers pronouns, and my anxiety and trauma were through the roof because I didn't fit those gender norm presentations, right? The presentation of my gender was outside of the norms, and so I was still experiencing that public shaming. I'm well into my 20s at this point. That look of consternation I have on my face is perfect for kind of how I felt a lot of the time in my body. So now you fast forward to this person, what I am now, and I have this incredibly lowered level of anxiety, incredibly lowered level of trauma because I fit in these gender norms. I now, because of the hair on my face, obviously the white skin has always been there, but my flat chest, my lowered tone of my voice, the length of my hair, the body structure that I have, all of those things, they just fit into what our society says is acceptable of men to look like, to white men to look like. And I'm still the same person. I'm still the female socialized person. Nothing about that of me has changed, but now I'm not worried about what are people thinking about me? Am I going to get called out? I'm not having all those experiences that I was explaining to you in the previous slide around anxiety and trauma. And so my psychological safety has increased, just flat out. So because of my psychological safety has increased, my anxiety has gone down, my trauma levels have gone down, I have the ability to be a more authentic me. Here I am, fully authentic, totally out. This is who I am. And I feel comfortable and I'm successful and I'm happy, right? But that's because of all these social structures that have said, it's okay, you fit. Well, when we think about authenticity, and this is really to all of you out there who are leaders, who are really wanting to make a difference in your organization, or even make a difference with your coworkers, are you truly ready to accept authenticity? We say that we want it, we know we want it, but are you really ready for what that means? And I'm going to tell you a story about somebody I worked for who was not ready. And this will really highlight how much people cannot be ready. When I was right out of grad school for my master's in social work, I went to go work for Department of Human Services for a little bit. And I interviewed for a position as a caseworker to work with teens in foster care. And I was about 5 years into my transition. So I looked pretty similar to this. And I was determined to be fully out. I wanted to be my authentic self. There was no reason for me to not be. And quite frankly, if they didn't want me as my authentic self, I didn't want to be there, right? So I just went in full bore. It was a great interview. I was fully out. I talked about being queer and trans, and it was a great time. They had teenagers on the panel to interview me. It was a fantastic interview. Everybody loved me. I loved everyone. I got the job. Great, no problem. I'm a few months into the job and I get pulled into a tiny little office with no windows and just one door from my supervisor, who says, I'm really uncomfortable with you talking about being trans so much in the office. I was absolutely floored. My anxiety went through the roof in a way that I hadn't experienced in a very long time. And I honestly didn't know what to say. I can't tell you actually what I said because I don't remember. It was like everything shut down. And she just went on to say, I know I shouldn't be saying this and I know it's not okay, but I just had to tell you because I don't know what else to do. And I'm just really uncomfortable with it. I would have been shocked if she had said this to me no matter what, but I was even more shocked because she was in that interview. She listened to me talk about who I am. She saw my authentic self. And she also has seen my coworkers come to me and ask me for advice and get professional development help around working with queer and trans kids in services. And I was an asset to that organization. And now I'm being told, well, you can't actually be yourself. You can be here, but you can't be yourself. So she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready for the authentic Cage. And I didn't know that. I didn't think that was I figured you're ready in the interview. Why wouldn't you be ready now? And these are the questions that she wasn't ready to answer. She wasn't ready and prepared to battle with her and wrestle with her biases. She wasn't prepared to find that comfort in discomfort. And she wasn't ready to change. She had her idea of what it would be like to have me there. She thought it was going to be great. She thought I was going to be a really great asset, and I was, but as long as I didn't talk about it. And so these are the questions that I think that if you're in any position of leadership, you have to ask yourself these questions, and you have to really think about, what does it mean when I tell the people that I work with, that work for me, that you know, especially if you're in a position of power and you say, I want you coming to work in your full authentic self. Are you prepared to love them like you love their culture? That's why I put this image up here. That's such a great image from the Ori Art Gallery in Portland. It's a queer, trans, BIPOC owned art gallery. And if you're in the position of, you're clearly here today because you want to learn. So if you're in the position of wanting to change things, then you're clearly in a position of wanting to understand people who are not part of your culture, right? Whatever that culture may be. You're wanting to get to know people outside of your culture. That's hard work. And you have to be willing to put in the work and answer these questions for yourself. And you're not going to get an answer right away. These are questions to constantly ask yourself as you're moving through this work. And so I share that specific story with you because I think it highlights so greatly how difficult the work is, and how much you need to prepare when you're really talking about authenticity.
Paige, can I interrupt just a moment?
Yep.
There's a question about your second question that they don't quite understand how that's phrased. Can you speak a little bit directly to that?
I can. I left it a little bit ambiguous because I always like it when people ask what this is. So this is a concept around the idea of, as you move through this work, you are going to be uncomfortable. It is just a nature of growth and learning new things. And so you're going to find times where you're just uncomfortable. Something, you don't understand a word that was said. You don't understand something about the culture that you've just experienced. There's some sort of thing that's outside of your knowledge base. Can you find the comfort in that feeling of discomfort? Can you find a way of sitting back and saying, oh, I don't know this. I'd like to know more about this. What's the best way for me to find out about this thing that I don't know? Is it to ask that person directly? Maybe that might be relevant and acceptable. Is it to read about it? Is it to talk to somebody else who maybe knows someone who can answer that question for me? But it's settling into that feeling of discomfort instead of pushing it away and saying, I'm uncomfortable. I can't keep going down that road. So that's what that question is getting at. Does that answer? Hopefully that answers that question. That's a tough subject.
We'll see if it does. And there was a question about whether or not you stayed at that job.
Oh, well, no, I did not stay at that job. I was already 1 foot out the door when that happened because I realized that was not the job for me. And serendipitously, that job was the last job that I held before I started these 2 businesses that I run now. That was kind of the last straw for me to work for somebody. I said, okay, I'm done working for other folks. I'm going to work for me. Yeah, I left that job. It was a sad job to leave. I loved those kids that I worked with. And I think I could have been a really great asset, but couldn't stay. Any other questions?
We will have a full Q&A the latter half hour, and I do encourage y'all to use the Q&A function to add those questions. C does add, whoops, just went away. Hold on here. I'm also wondering about how to stay safe at work when almost everyone is not ready to be authentic. Would you like that question now, Cage, or do you want to, I can hold that till the end?
Let's hold that to the end because
Okay.
I'll get through this last little bit of content and that may shed some light on that question. We'll see.
Okay. All right. We'll come back to you, C. Thank you.
Great.
We
All right.
also have,
Yep.
also have 2, there was 2 raised hands. Should we just wait for just a moment until you get through the presentation and we'll get to questions?
If people are okay with that, let's just wait for a moment because the last little bit here I've got, it's kind of the last, for lack of better words, punch in the face that I've got for everybody around this topic. So hopefully that'll get to maybe some more people's questions.
Excellent, thank you.
Sorry for that kind of violent reference. That's not what I meant to really finish with. Let's see. So the last subject or part that I want to get to about safety is this idea around subjectivity, in that safety is up to each individual to determine what makes them feel safe. And this kind of really wraps up everything that we're talking about and how difficult it can be to cultivate psychological safety in the workplace because it is so subjective. And I'm going to highlight here through another story my experience of this. So when I talk about the experience of being, a trans person and having this kind of position of male privilege that I've found myself in, people, often cisgender women, ask me, what does it feel like? What does that mean that you have male privilege? You can kind of speak to it. And I found it really hard to describe what that exactly feels like. And I've found it surprising that I can't describe it. I thought for sure it would be tangible things that I could say, yes, this is what it feels like to have male privilege. But it's hard. It's more nuanced than that. And I recently had an experience with my partner that really crystallized why it's so hard. So let me tell you a little bit about my partner, because that's important to this. Her name's Jimmy, which throws people off all the time. She's a cisgender woman, queer identified woman, presents on the feminine end of the spectrum with the name Jimmy. So that's a whole other topic. She and I moved into a new neighborhood somewhat recently, and she told me one day that she didn't feel comfortable walking around the neighborhood. And when she told me this, I honestly had a feeling of like defensiveness almost, and sort of like, oh, you're being overreactive and you're being an alarmist, sort of a really standard kind of cis heterosexual male response. And I had that response because I found the neighborhood completely safe and I had no questions of feeling unsafe there. And when I said that to her, she said she had to remind me of my gender presentation, because I kind of forget sometimes what I look like. So she had to remind me of my gender presentation and how I'm interpreted. And of course, I'm not going to feel unsafe. Yeah, duh. I'm a white man looking like I'm straight and cisgender. Why would I feel unsafe? So then a few months after that conversation, the first rounds of shutdowns happened with COVID. We were, locked into our houses, and She was trying to get some more exercise just to reduce her stress and her anxiety around everything, as we all were trying to do. And she started taking more walks on her own and kind of further out the neighborhood. And she was getting to areas that she felt even less safe. And she started having men slow down and leer at her out of the car as they drove by. She told me this. I mean, she stopped walking, first of all, that just cut that out immediately. And when she told me this, I was shocked again, not because I don't know that men do awful, terrible things like leer and catcall and all of those things, but because, again, I was feeling so incredibly safe. I was going for solo runs in that same neighborhood along those same streets, not experiencing any of that. We were living in two different worlds. That's the important piece to hold on to here for a minute. We were in two different worlds. I felt completely safe. She felt nothing of safety. That is white male privilege. I was able to go and take care of my needs. I was able to get exercise. I was able to reduce my anxiety. I was able to increase my mental health, my physical health during an incredibly stressful time, and therefore increase my psychological safety. And I had that privilege. That is what white male privilege looks like, particularly when you look straight. That experience highlights so drastically how difficult it is for the dominant culture to recognize how their privilege benefits them on these small levels. You may be able to recognize how your privilege benefits you on large levels, financially, social status, whatever it may be. Those bigger macro levels can be a little bit easier to figure out. But that kind of situation, I had to really, really think about long and hard about what that meant and what that meant for me and why that I have that privilege and how that impacts me as a person and how it impacts her as a person. And I am a female socialized person. I am a queer person, a trans person who educates people around gender diversity and gender issues. And I had a hard time teasing it apart. So I highlight that and I tell you that part because this work is so challenging. It has got so many layers to it, and it requires you to stop, slow down, take a second, think about the words that are just being said to you. My partner and I actually got into some bits of argument around this because I still wasn't really able to hold that space in my mind of what her experience was. Part of that is because I am 13 years into being almost 14 years into being on testosterone. And I will tell you that being a part of privileged white male society, it has seeped into my psyche and my behavior without my permission, by the way. And so only because I have had these other kinds of experiences where I can see the other side of it, I can see behind this like secret curtain, do I have the ability to step back and say, whoa, okay, that's not actually how things are supposed to work. It's not supposed to be that I feel safe and she doesn't, right? That's a problem with our society. That's a problem with our structure. That's not a problem with what she's wearing, where she is, all these terrible BS things that are told to women when men are doing those awful, terrible things. But also the other aspect of why that's challenging for me is that if you think about my gender presentation as a young person, I wasn't presenting my gender in any feminine way that resulted in me getting catcalled. I've never experienced being catcalled. I've never experienced people leering at me in that creepy sexual way, right? So I had to also filter through that experience. All of this, and this is what I'm going to leave you with, and we'll jump into question and answer. All of this goes all the way back to the beginning of this presentation an hour ago and 400 plus years ago of the way that society was constructed. And it was constructed out of what was seen as necessary at that time. It is not necessary anymore. None of those constructs are necessary for how our society needs to function now. but it has been so long, and it has been only a small, tiny group of people at the top who've continued to propagate and continue to push those ideas across space and time, that the rest of us, even those who are at the top and want to do this work, we have to pull it apart and we have to remanufacture it. It's all been manufactured. It's all just ideas and concepts. There's nothing written in stone. It seems that way, but it's not true. And so we have the ability, our human brains created those ideas and concepts at that long ago time. Our human brains can recreate the concepts in a totally new way, in a totally different fashion, but it takes digging into yourself and your psyche and finding out who you are at the core to think about what can you let go of? What are you holding on to from those constructs, and what can you let go of? What have you let go of, and what do you still have to let go of? And that's where I think the work comes, and that's where cultivating psychological safety ultimately resides, is deconstructing privilege in that way. And I will leave it at that final thought and open up for question. I really appreciate everybody's attention and